The summer heat in Bladenboro, North Carolina, was oppressive. A golden sun cast long shadows across the dense forests, a stark contrast to the sprawling flatlands that Viggo Larson had grown up around in Denver. His days off as an ambulance driver were usually spent fishing along the Front Range, relishing the solitude the sport provided. But this trip was supposed to be different. A change of pace, a chance to reconnect with old friends and leave the chaos of his job behind for a few nights. They were a group of 6. Viggo, his childhood friends Emily and Jake, and 3 of Emily's acquaintances. The plan was simple, a road trip with stops at obscure towns and forgotten trails, their temporary home being a rustic cabin deep in the woods near Bladenboro. Viggo had heard rumors about the area, strange whispers about a creature that stalked the forests at night, but he had dismissed them. Folklore was just a part of small-town charm, after all. On the second evening, they built a fire behind the cabin. The air was warm, cicadas humming in the distance. They shared stories, laughed, and sipped beer, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the tree line. Viggo couldn't shake the feeling that the woods seemed too quiet. The distant calls of owls were absent, and even the insects seemed muted. Emily was the first to point out the smell, a heavy, metallic tang mixed with the musk of decay wafted through the clearing. Jake joked that someone had left food out too long, but Viggo's gut told him otherwise. He remembered his dad's words from when they used to hunt together. When something smells dead, something alive isn't far behind. Later that night, Viggo couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch, gazing at the dark forest under a cloudless, star-speckled sky. That's when he saw it. At first, it was just movement, a shadow slipping between the trees. Then it stepped into the moonlight, a hulking figure, half hidden behind a tree. The shape of its body was almost human, but the elongated limbs and unnaturally angular posture sent a chill down his spine. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the firelight like distant embers. Viggo's breath caught in his throat. He thought of the stories. Locals called it the Beast of Bladenboro, a werewolf-like creature infamous for livestock killings in the 1950s. His father had mentioned it once, laughing at the absurdity of it, but here it was, staring back at him. He retreated inside, locking the door as quietly as possible. By the time he roused the others, the creature was gone. They laughed nervously at his story, attributing it to too much beer or an overactive imagination. But Viggo knew better. He stayed up the rest of the night, gripping the hunting knife he'd brought along for the trip. The next day passed uneventfully, though Viggo's unease never lifted. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they prepared for another night around the fire. This time, everyone was on edge, the eerie silence of the forest pressing in on them. Emily suggested they turn in early, but Viggo insisted they stay together. It was safer that way. The attack came without warning. The firelight flickered as a low growl echoed from the trees. Viggo stood, scanning the darkness, knife in hand. Then it lunged, a blur of fur and claws. Jake screamed as the creature tackled him to the ground, its jaws snapping inches from his face. Viggo and another friend, Tyler, charged, swinging knives and a heavy branch they'd grabbed in desperation. The beast snarled, a guttural primal sound that vibrated through Viggo's chest. The fight was chaos. Blood sprayed as Jake slashed wildly, landing a lucky hit on the creature's shoulder. It recoiled, emitting a howl that made Viggo's ears ring. For a moment it seemed unsure, its glowing eyes darting between them and the woods. Then, with a final snarl, it disappeared into the trees. Jake's leg was badly injured, a deep gash oozing blood onto the dirt. They couldn't stay. Viggo made the call to leave everything behind, including the campfire. Supporting Jake between them, they moved as quickly as they could, sticking to narrow trails to avoid open spaces. The journey through the forest was harrowing. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch sent shivers down Viggo's spine. He thought about his family. His mother's laugh when she'd tease him for his meticulous fishing gear, his dad's patient instructions on how to gut a trout. Those moments felt like another lifetime. As the night stretched on, they heard it again. Heavy footsteps, too deliberate to be an animal. The creature was following them, toying with them. Vigo whispered for everyone to stay silent. They moved in single file, Jake leaning heavily on Emily and grimacing with every step. Hours passed before they reached the edge of the forest. The first light of dawn painted the trees in shades of gray and gold. Ahead, the faint outline of a road came into view. They stumbled onto the asphalt, just as a pickup truck crested the hill. The driver slammed on the brakes, his eyes wide with alarm as he took in their bloodied and exhausted forms. They never explained what happened to the driver, just begged him to take them to the nearest town. By the time they reached safety, Jake was barely conscious and the others were too shaken to speak. Vigo never returned to Bladenboro, and he never told anyone outside the group about what they saw. But late at night, when he was alone with his thoughts, he couldn't shake the memory of those glowing eyes and the smell of blood in the air. The beast of Bladenboro was real, and it was still out there. The drive up to Maine had been uneventful, the kind of trip Michael Evans enjoyed. An ambulance driver by profession, he was accustomed to chaos, and the promise of peace, even if shared with strangers, had lured him into booking the organized winter tour. Michael's dog, Cooper, a scrappy mutt with boundless energy, sat at his side, watching the road like he could sense the turn of fate ahead. Michael hailed from Salt Lake City, a city bordered by craggy mountains and long desert highways. On weekends, he hiked to clear his mind, a habit born from years of navigating life and death moments in the back of an ambulance. The white slopes of Maine, draped in fog and rain, felt far from home, but somehow fitting. The group, a mix of tourists and enthusiasts, was here to explore the wooded wilderness near Bar Harbor for a day before retreating to the warmth of civilization. The rain started as a drizzle, dotting the frozen ground with shallow puddles. By the time they reached the campsite, nestled deep in the forest, it had become a persistent shower, soaking the dead leaves and dark soil. The tour guide, a middle-aged man with an authoritative air, told them the rain was typical for Maine winters. "Keeps the woods quiet," he said with a grin, though the quietness was unsettling rather than comforting. That evening, they gathered around a fire hastily built under a tarp. The flames sputtered and hissed in protest against the rain. Conversation buzzed about local legends, bear encounters, mountain lions, and the whispers of something older. One of the tourists, a woman with a flair for drama, mentioned stories of creatures that mimicked voices and shapes. Michael dismissed it as harmless storytelling, the kind people use to make their vacations feel exciting. Cooper barked, snapping Michael from his thoughts. The dog had been staring at the dark tree line, his ears pinned back, growling low. It wasn't unusual for dogs to get jittery in the woods, but something about Cooper's unease made Michael's skin crawl. He grabbed a flashlight and swept it toward the forest. The beam illuminated gnarled branches and rain-slicked bark, but nothing moved. The guide suggested they turn in early since the rain showed no signs of stopping. Michael volunteered for the first watch, a precautionary measure against wildlife, and stayed near the fire with Cooper curled at his feet. The woods seemed endless, the rain muting distant sounds into an eerie, watery symphony. His flashlight occasionally caught shapes in the shadows, but they always turned out to be stumps or hanging moss, until they weren't. It started as a flicker, a movement too deliberate to be the wind. Michael tensed, the light of his fire suddenly feeling too small. Cooper's growl deepened, more urgent now. Michael turned the flashlight back toward the forest, and there it was, a figure standing just beyond the reach of the firelight. It looked human, but wrong. Its stance unnaturally rigid, its head tilted too far to one side. Michael called out, his voice shaking despite himself. "Hey, are you lost?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it mimicked his words, a perfect echo, but without emotion. The group stirred awake as Michael stepped back toward them, his knife now in hand. The figure stepped closer, revealing features that made Michael's stomach churn. Its skin was stretched too tightly over its bones, and its eyes were hollow pits reflecting the firelight. Then it smiled, a wide, if grotesque grin that showed far too many teeth. Panic erupted. The creature lunged, its speed unnatural, claws glinting like shards of obsidian. The guide tried to intervene, swinging a hatchet, but the creature moved too quickly, slashing his chest open with a sickening sound. The man collapsed, blood pooling in the mud. Michael shouted for the group to run, grabbing Cooper's leash as he bolted toward the trail. The rain turned the ground into a slick mess, their boots slipping as they fled through the maze of trees. The creature's shrieks followed them, echoing unnervingly like the cries of the injured guide. It wasn't chasing outright, but stalking, its footsteps deliberate and terrifyingly close. Michael's mind raced, recalling snatches of what the dramatic tourist had said, legends of skinwalkers, shape-shifting beings from Navajo lore. He didn't know much about them, but he remembered they were dangerous, cunning predators that hunted with malevolent intent. They pressed on, desperate and disoriented, losing 2 members of the group to the creature's swift, brutal attacks. Michael didn't look back, focusing only on the path ahead. His flashlight flickered, the batteries weakened by the damp, but he kept moving. The forest began to thin, revealing hints of the road beyond. Relief surged as they stumbled onto the asphalt, their breaths ragged and eyes wild. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, the rumble of an engine breaking the suffocating silence. Michael waved frantically, and the car slowed, a pickup truck driven by a startled local. They piled in, Cooper barking hysterically as the truck sped off toward the nearest town. Michael sat in the truck bed, cradling Cooper as he stared back at the woods. The rain blurred the shapes, but he swore he saw the creature watching, its hollow eyes reflecting the truck's taillights. When they reached safety, Michael couldn't find the words to explain what had happened. The survivors were too shaken to confirm anything, and the local authorities dismissed it as a bear attack. But Michael knew the truth, even if he couldn't bring himself to say it. Some things in the woods aren't meant to be understood, and some places, like the rain-drenched forests of Maine, are better left undisturbed. I've worked hard my whole life. Simple stuff, nothing glamorous, just enough to get by and keep things steady. That's why, when the chance to join a weekend trip through the backwoods of Michigan came up, I thought, why not? I don't take many breaks, and the thought of a couple of days away from the grind, meeting new people, sounded like a welcome change. The travel agency promised a scenic, guided tour, complete with campfire dinners and walks through some of Michigan's most remote and beautiful areas. It seemed like just the thing I needed. My name's Viggo Reeves. I'm from Wichita, a city that runs on hardworking folks like me. It's flat out there, the kind of place where horizons stretch forever and the sound of freight trains becomes a lullaby. When I wasn't at my job or working on side projects, I was usually at my buddy's place, rolling dice over a Warhammer 40K board, losing myself in battles between armies of miniature soldiers. It's not something I advertise to strangers, but it's a decent way to unwind. Out here in Michigan, though, there wasn't much to roll dice about. Just endless forest, scattered sunshine filtering through the treetops, and a van full of strangers. We were about halfway through the first day when things started going wrong. The tour van shuddered once, twice, then gave up completely. We coasted to a stop on a dirt road, miles from anything resembling civilization. The driver, a gruff older man who looked like he'd seen 100 roadside breakdowns, muttered a string of curses and told us to sit tight. He'd call for help, but out here, cell service was more dream than reality. The group decided to pass the time by setting up camp. There was no point in staying cooped up in the van. It was sunny, but there was a crispness in the air that warned the season hadn't fully committed to spring yet. We built a fire near the edge of the woods, joking about how we'd just turned a guided tour into a survival adventure. The sun dipped lower as the hours passed, casting long shadows across the road. That's when Cooper, a sharp-eyed hiker from the group, noticed something odd. "Hey, anyone else hear that?" he said, cocking his head toward the woods. At first, we all dismissed it as wind rustling the branches, but then it came again. A low, guttural sound. Not a growl, not exactly, but something that didn't fit. The guide, trying to keep everyone calm, said it was probably just a coyote. "They're common around here," he assured us. "But I've heard coyotes back home, and this didn't sound like one." The firelight danced against the trunks of the trees as the sound grew closer. I gripped my pocket knife instinctively, wishing I had something more substantial. Then we saw it, or at least part of it. A shadow, long and distorted, moved just beyond the fire's reach. It was too big to be a deer, and the way it moved was wrong. Its steps were jerky, unnatural, like it didn't know how to walk properly. "Stay here," the guide said, grabbing a flashlight and heading toward the woods. We watched him disappear into the dark, the beam of his light bobbing along. He didn't come back. Minutes passed like hours. We called his name, but the only answer was the sound again, louder this time. Then, out of the shadows, something crawled, or slithered. It was hard to tell. It looked human at first, but its proportions were off. Arms too long, legs too thin, skin stretched tight over its frame. The firelight caught its eyes, hollow and black, like two pits sucking in the light. Chaos erupted. Someone screamed, and the creature lunged, dragging one of the tourists into the dark with a guttural snarl. The rest of us ran. We grabbed what we could, bags, knives, whatever was within reach, and bolted into the woods. The fire still burned behind us, casting flickering shadows that made it hard to tell what was real. We stumbled through the trees, the undergrowth clawing at our clothes. I heard something behind us, heavy footsteps, twigs snapping. The creature wasn't chasing us, it was stalking, herding us like prey. It mimicked the cries of the person it had taken, its voice distorted and wrong, sending shivers down my spine. We spent the night huddled together in a hollow beneath a fallen tree. No one spoke much, just whispered prayers and muffled sobs. I thought about the stories I'd heard, the ones people told about shapeshifters and spirits in these woods. I never believed them before, but now they felt too close for comfort. At dawn, the creature came again, its distorted form visible through the mist. We ran, every man and woman for themselves. A few didn't make it. I don't like to think about what happened to them. Eventually, we found a road. A real road, not the dirt trail we'd started on. A trucker stopped when he saw us, his face pale as we climbed into the cab. He didn't ask questions, just drove until the forest was far behind. Back in town, we told the authorities, but they didn't believe us. They said it was a bear or maybe a wolf, but we knew better. Whatever was out there wasn't natural. It wasn't an animal. It was something ancient, something that didn't belong. I still hear the sounds sometimes, low, guttural, echoing in my dreams, and I know I'll never step foot in those woods again.